Hi, this is John O'Brien, and I'm a retired Garda. And like many of my colleagues, I was horrified by what happened in Dublin last week. The extent of the violence, the damage caused, and the attacks on the Garda Síochána. And indeed, our thoughts and our hearts go out to our colleagues who were faced with that mob situation in the centre of Dublin. I've had a lifelong interest in public order policing, have been present at two of the most serious riots that happened in Dublin. That's at the British Embassy in 1972 and again at a relocated British Embassy in 1981 and many other flashpoint areas as well over the years. I've written widely on the subject and studied on it. I was responsible for training guards in public order techniques probably nearly 30 years ago, or probably over 30 years ago, and I did undertake a study of the societal factors present in Dublin 1 and 2 way back in the 2000s, as well as studying the whole public order situation at a university overseas. In relation to what happened last week, I deliberately chose the title, The Anatomy of a Riot in Dublin. And what happened was like what a catastrophic health event would be in the human body. But only in this case it was in an attack on civil society, on the body politic, and on the Garda Síochána. It was unique in many respects is that it was an attack on the crime scene where a horrible assault or assaults had been committed a short time earlier. It's one of the rare occasions that the Garda Síochána as an institution had been physically attacked by a mob in this state. Some examples way back in the day in the Troubles along the border and a few other places as well, but this was quite unique. Very important question is, was it foreseeable? Could we have known, could have the civil authorities, could have the minister or the commissioner foreseen what was going to happen? Now, both of the minister and commissioner have said very clearly that it wouldn't be possible to predict exactly what was going to happen, but one has to listen carefully when they use those kind of words. But remarkably, both have produced now a raft of measures which they say would now speculate would prevent or mitigate the like of that event happening in the future. Surely, if those measures could be pulled literally out of a hat in the space of 72 hours after the event, it ought to have been possible as part of a preventative strategy to have introduced some or all of those measures long before the events that took place in O'Connell Street took place. Indeed, one is tempted to say if they had been reading the signs, reading the warning signs, these measures would have been introduced, as I said, much before that event. Now, it may not be coincidental, but the policing space has been racked with crisis in the last number of years, and maybe the Minister and Commissioner were just distracted from looking at an event like this in terms of preparedness. Now, I'm not going to look exactly at what happened on the day and to draw maybe some conclusions at how difficult the task was for colleagues who were involved in that in the terms of dealing with it. In the first event, they were dealing with a situation of the assault here that happened on Parnell Square. And that was from about 1:30. And they were dealing with that in the middle of an afternoon that clearly was an afternoon, probably like many others in the Dublin city centre for policing colleagues. In other words, they were dealing with the normal fracas, attending to crime scenes, doing normal policing, doing all of those events. And then this event happened, which then obviously dragged resources in there, which involves proper crime investigation and specifically cordoning off the area so that after the unfortunate victims have been removed so that evidence may be preserved. And they were in the business of doing that. And that was logical. And I think there was a press release in the middle of the afternoon to say that this was not, or the guards believed that it wasn't a terrorist offence and that it was likely a standalone. But almost simultaneously, the social media sites began to circulate messages which were obviously based on an anti-immigration agenda, and the different hashtags that were used are well known. I'm not going to repeat them here, and the information was being circulated widely, and then a crowd probably from around 4 o'clock began to converge on the crime scene area. And remember, there is a cordon here, a crime scene cordon, and they began to involve in minor clashes with the guards. Some firecrackers were thrown. The throwing of the firecrackers and other events signalled the start of the disorder, which eventually was to lead to the riots that we're well familiar with. And this was a remarkable event, an attack on a crime scene where a horrible assault or assaults had taken place by a mob, intent on corrupting the crime scene, intent on attacking the members of the Garda Síochána who were present and whose job it was to investigate this. And all of this is happening in the middle of what is, in inverted commas, a normal afternoon in Dublin inner city policing. So this was an unprecedented situation to that degree. It was obvious, of course, pretty sharply that this was no longer a normal crime scene location and that other events were in thrall. And so obviously public order units and the guards were necessary to deal with the situation, the availability of those units and the need to muster and get them to the location was obviously a major priority. But in reality, it was also an extremely difficult situation for those very logistical reasons. In event, and it's well recorded elsewhere, that the trouble that initially started in the area of the red zone, the red zone here, began to move itself away from there as the Garda who arrived and who began to take up the contact with the mob at that stage. And obviously the mob was forced back to some extent from the junction of Parnell Street and with Parnell Square, and then they began to move away, obviously followed by guards, but who are now moving from their defensive situation, moving to a situation that had them moving down O'Connell Street to the side streets of O'Connell Street, to these areas. And of course any movement like that, and as it was on this occasion on foot, dissipates the Garda resources even more. They're no longer concentrated in a tight area, which is in some ways easier to defend or so on, and they are moving, carrying their shields and so on. And eventually, as we now know, and I don't plan to go through the events in terms of line by line devastation, because we're now all aware of what happened, and of course it's spread across the Liffey as well, and in many different directions, so it is obvious that we were in an uncontrolled situation for a period of time, because it was impossible to contain it in a physical area, because it no longer was in a physical area. The mob were moving away, the guards were pursuing, the guards themselves were under pressure. There was extreme damage to property, extreme disruption to civil society. So really the question was, which I posed at the start, was, could any of this be foreseen? Now, the absolute dynamic of this particular riot could not have been foreseen to that extent, or to the extent necessary. But the real question is, because now both Minister and Commissioner have posited that they have solutions that will mitigate this in the future, how come, if the ability to come up with solutions that would mitigate, how come that those were not recognised, on the build-up to this riot? How come that measures hadn't been taken to enhance the public order capacity of the guards, to deal with the ever-present problem of Garda numbers and uniform numbers on the streets? Now, policing is all about confidence, the confidence that the community repose in the policing element, in our case, in the Garda Síochána. Politics, of course, is also about confidence and the degree to which the community holds confidence in the political institutions, and in this case in the minister and the government, in terms of doing and dealing with the very clear challenges which lay ahead. Much is disturbing on the narrative that have got us to this particular point, and it really is an open question as to whether or not confidence can be maintained if there are no dramatic changes in the situation as we now know it.